everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Reappropriate the Vlog, the exclusive vlog for patrons of Reappropriate on Patreon. In particular, I want to thank everyone for again committing your funds and resources to helping support Reappropriate. And if you hadn't noticed, in this past week, your support has helped to create a new look for Reappropriate. In particular, a look that is now mobile friendly for everybody who uses smartphones and tablets to read Reappropriate content. So without further ado, today I want to talk to you a little bit about solidarity. And this topic comes from a reader who suggested after last month's episode that I talk a little bit about building and cultivating community and allies within the Asian American community. And this is a pretty broad topic, so I thought I would begin to tackle that by breaking that down into a few key points that I think are important when it comes to solidarity work within the Asian American community. Today, I kind of want to give three major points that I think are really important for anybody doing anti-racism work as an Asian American. So the first point I want to make is that cultivating community as an Asian American anti-racist activist means to me cultivating community across different racial groups. And the reason for that is because I think as anti-racism activists, we need to recognize the structural roots of the racism that we're combating, and that we need to work with our allies in other communities in order to fully dismantle white supremacy. And I think that this isn't a novel idea for Asian Americans. In fact, when this topic was first raised by the person who suggested it, I thought back to the work of 1968 Asian American radicals who essentially birthed what we now call the Asian American movement. So if you look, for example, at the mission statement of Ihe Chen, which was a radical Asian American group formed in the late 1960s. One of the things that they talk about in their mission statement is that they want liberation of all third world peoples and other oppressed peoples. People of color, they say, Asian, Black, Brown, Red, are all fighting for liberation from America's racist oppression. We recognize that only when the oppression of all people is ended can we all really be free. And this is another idea picked up by the Asian American Political Alliance, also founded in 1968 on the UC Berkeley campus. They say in their mission statement, we Asian Americans support all non-white liberation movements and believe that all minorities, in order to be truly liberated, must have complete control over the political, economical, and educational institutions within their respective communities. So for both these groups, and as well as many other Asian American radicals of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the idea of working in solidarity with other communities of color was just sort of the obvious solution if we wanted to dismantle the structural racism that impacts all of us and enacts violence against all Black and Brown people. And that I think is very relevant to what's going on today. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, which most recently has made headlines through the hashtag Take the Knee or Take a Knee movement, with NFL athletes taking a knee during the national anthem to further the work that was first started by Colin Kaepernick. And I think Asian Americans have a responsibility, both to our own anti-racism work as well as to this larger effort of solidarity, to join that movement. And so it's really disheartening to see that support for Black Lives Matter remains somewhat of a controversial topic within the Asian American community. While there are a lot of progressives who are Asian American who fully support joining forces with Black Lives Matter through, for example, the hashtag Asians for Black Lives, there are other Asian American activists who either are sort of silent on the topic of Black Lives Matter or even somewhat opposed to working in solidarity with other communities of color. So I'm reminded, for example, of the very large protest movements around Peter Liang, for example, which positioned itself directly at odds with Black Lives Matter. And in the context of those conversations, you had Asian Americans who were espousing very anti-Black sentiment. And I think that this is very narrow-minded and very myopic for Asian Americans to focus solely on racism as it affects Asian Americans, while at the same time essentially throwing Black and Brown communities under the bus. The source of the racism that Asian Americans face isn't limited solely to Asian Americans. It is part of a larger white supremacist system. I'm fond of saying that a system that doesn't value Black lives can never truly value Asian American lives either. By that I mean, I don't see how Asian Americans can or should pursue privilege or proximity to whiteness within an unfair or racist system, especially if that has to occur at the cost or expense of Black or Brown people. And so when it comes to take a knee or take the knee, I'm strongly in support of Asian Americans who have chosen to use whatever platforms they have to demonstrate solidarity with take a knee or take the knee. Just last week, I tweeted about Dr. Eugene Gu, who is a doctor at a hospital, and he has many Twitter followers, and he used his Twitter platform to tweet a picture of himself taking a knee in support with the Take the Knee movement and Black Lives Matter. And I also tweeted about how he received many threats, both physical as well as trolling and racist insults, and most importantly, death threats. And I think that demonstrates that the most threatening thing that Asian Americans can do is to really reject this idea of wanting to reinforce a white supremacist system in order to receive personal privilege or racial privilege for Asian Americans at the cost of others. Asian Americans have traditionally been positioned as the model minority, and that is a position that is fundamentally and from the outset anti-Black. And I think that Asian Americans who choose to challenge our position as the model minority by joining forces with Black Lives Matter really threaten the system by demonstrating that proximity to whiteness is not something that we covet and is something that we can openly reject in favor or in lieu of a system that's more fair to all people. And so I think by recognizing how our oppressions as Asian Americans are interconnected with the racial oppression of other groups is key to anti-racism solidarity work as an Asian American. I think the second thing that we need to do as anti-racism activists and Asian Americans is to make sure that we're fully aware and fully acknowledge what we don't know about other communities and to commit to learn about them. I think that it can be very easy as Asian Americans to focus solely on our own community and assume that because we have expertise and authority within our own community that we don't have to learn about other groups. But I think that that's really sabotaging the efforts of solidarity. The reason I bring this up is because in the last month, there was this film called Yellowstone that had cast an actor from the Asian American community. Her name is Kelsey Aspil Chow, or her stage name is Kelsey Aspil. And she was cast to play a Native woman. And she had previously played a Native woman in another film as well. And in order to justify or rationalize her casting, she had said that she was descended from the East Band of Cherokee Indian Nation. But the Native community was sort of skeptical about this claim, and eventually a Native activist actually contacted the East Band of Cherokee Indian Nation and asked whether they had any evidence of Aspil being a descendant from the nation. And they looked through their rolls, and they were unable to find any evidence that Aspil had any lineal descent from any of the original members of the tribe, which really called into question her claim of being a multiracial Native woman. And this discovery led many within the Native community to renew their cries for a boycott of Yellowstone and to ask that the film not essentially wash away the identity of the character that Aspil is playing by casting a non-Native woman in that role. And I think that this is an issue that really resonated or should have really resonated with the Asian American community, given that our community is very energized by issues of whitewashing in Hollywood. You know, most recently we had been talking about Hellboy and Ed Skrein, who was originally cast in a role of a Japanese American character and who was lauded among the Asian American community for deciding to give up that role and allowing a different Asian American actor, in this case Daniel Dae Kim, to be cast in his place. And I think that that is one of several examples of whitewashing in Hollywood that has really galvanized Asian Americans. So this is clearly an issue that resonates with us. And yet when it came to Yellowstone, the Asian American community was largely silent on the topic. And when we weren't silent, I was very disheartened to see Asian Americans talking about Native identity in a way that really suggested that there wasn't a lot of awareness about the intricacies of Native identity as a political as well as racial identity. And there was virtually no understanding that I could see of how tribal membership and tribal politics works. I'm not an expert on Native identity or Native identity politics, and I don't claim to be. So for that reason, I think that the best thing that I could do was to acknowledge that my position as an Asian American didn't grant me the privilege to decide for the Native community who was and who wasn't a Native person. Rather than to speak over other communities, I think we just need to sometimes take a step back and acknowledge the things that we don't know. And part of that is to build better relationships with other communities of color so that we can create forums and space for learning and dialogue. The last thing that I think that is really important if we want to do solidarity work is to constantly be mindful about how we're making space or not. That can mean, again, creating relationships and intentionally creating relationships with other communities of color so that we can make sure that our work is truly focused on larger systems and not focused exclusively on ourselves. So we need to make space, for example, for conversations about Yellowstone or Black Lives Matter, or how the Trump administration is devaluing brown lives in Puerto Rico right now. All of us, whether we run a blog or not, can be more mindful about the ways in which we use our platforms online to try and amplify the voices of other communities. So if you have a Twitter account, for example, how many non-Asian Americans are you following? How many Black folk and brown folk are you retweeting on a daily basis? How many news outlets are we visiting that aren't focused directly on Asian American news? These are questions that we can be asking ourselves daily. And if the answer is unsatisfactory, we have the power within our own grasp to make space for those voices within our own platforms. And the larger goal, I think, is because, again, we need to acknowledge that fighting racism isn't about improving our own lot. It's about identifying the unfairness of the system that we all live under and trying to make institutional changes to end white supremacy and structural racism. And that can't happen if we allow white supremacy to continue this tactic that it's historically used, which is this divide and conquer tactic between different communities of color. I think that as Asian Americans, as well as other people of color, we need to abjectly reject that strategy of divide and conquer and instead join forces to see that all of our oppressions are interconnected and therefore our work must be interconnected as well. So once again, the three things that I think that we need to be doing as Asian Americans committed to solidarity is one, we need to acknowledge or recognize our oppressions as interconnected. Two, we need to learn about other communities of color. And sometimes that means taking a step back and acknowledging what we don't know. And three, I think we need to make space for the work of other movements. And sometimes that means building relationships and drawing connections between the racism that Asian Americans face and the kinds of racism that other people of color face. And sometimes that means stepping back and not speaking over our allies in other communities of color, and instead amplifying their voices within our own platforms. So going forward, I hope that as Asian Americans, we can do a little bit better when it comes to being in solidarity with other communities of color. And I think that these three steps are a good start. Again, I want to thank you all for watching this episode of this vlog and also for being a patron of Reappropriate and supporting our work. And I look forward to seeing y'all in a couple of weeks. Take care. Bye.